Hello everyone, today we talk about Byzantine Italy and more in particular the 7th century disgregation of Byzantine public authority in the peninsula. It's not the first video about Byzantine Italy. We made some interesting ones, also some basic sort of introductory videos to Byzantine Italy as a whole and the various regions, histories that basically began to depart exactly from this moment onwards. This is an important topic also as far as the relation between Rome and the general Italic, right, Latin background of the peninsula clashed with the Greco-Byzantine imperial ambitions, and or at least how, in fact, the Romano-Germanic world was basically reclaiming some autonomy, even in those lands that formerly belonged to the empire. We'll see now how, right? We have also to resume Longobarд history, especially the royal one of the 7th century is quite crucial to understand the various steps that were being taken. Today we don't talk about the Longobards, but I use the adjective Romano-Germanic for a reason, because you can't basically understand why this fragmentation from the Byzantine side was occurring if you don't picture, of course, what was happening in the rest of the empire, but specifically how and why in Italy the Longobards gained the upper hand, right? We also have to absolutely talk about Gregory the Great, better, Saint Benedict of Nursia. Like, it's incredible that in over 2,400 videos, I've never really made a video about Saint Benedict, his rule, the Benedictine order as a whole. Really, monastic history is crucial, but this one, even in more particular terms. In fact, this topic mostly revolves around the very meaning of the empire in many ways. You know that Schwerpunkt has analyzed with conviction the notion that basically the Romanity of the empire kept laying in the West. I recently made a video about the basilicas of the urbs. We discussed at large the centrality of Rome and the fact that that wasn't properly an end of Roman centrality in medieval times. On the contrary, there is a radical continuity also as far as the sort of relative importance of Rome and properly its Romano-Italic background really had for the world West. We made recently videos, for example, about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons that prepotently show like the axis that was forming between Rome, the Franks, and in fact England in this quite tormented moment in history, the so-called Dark Ages, that however highlight actually a great deal of spiritual unity and a glowing capacity that in a time where objectively resources were scarce and the empire was lagging behind in terms of capacity to recover, and was in fact giving way to the different actors that could, in this sense, would wield the Roman Empire on their own, I think is quite relevant. There is a great gap, I would say, in pop culture in general between the end of the so-called end of the Western half, at least not the Western, because there weren't ever two kingdoms. Like, it doesn't make any theological, metaphysical sense to claim that it was a different empires. The imperium is the Holy Ghost, is victory, is Nike, and Charlemagne, as if also the deal with the papacy or what was entailed by the Romanity of the Frankish empire and its further successors was just a matter of, you know, some accident or some ad hoc contingential invention that nobody had really thought it was weird and nobody thought. Of course, we'll come back on that specific topic. I have actually prepared a video about Charlemagne and that kind of more comprehensive view on his European leadership that that will, like, in due time explain some of these aspects. I have a Renovatio Imperii playlist, but that mostly revolves, in fact, around the Carolingian and the Ottonian era. And instead, like, I think that one cannot fully understand how and why Romanity continued through those institutions if they skip the 6th, the 7th century, and pretend that basically the Roman Empire in the West was not there, and that basically like our understanding of it is just the legalistic and sort of statalistic view that the same Byzantines, by the way, could basically push in terms of legitimacy. This is not what they actually believed themselves at the time. It was actually a great problem, in fact. But in particular, also the relation with the papacy and the empire highlight the older problem that will be also essentially the one of the later investiture controversy. It is to say, what is the actual limit of these two powers, right? How can an ecumenic empire be try to dictate rule essentially to the church, as actually the Byzantines succeeded in Constantinople, but not in Rome, right? And where does, in fact, the Holy Ghost really lay in terms of imperial power and in terms of actual power, like as such, right? And so how did the papacy develop temporally and spiritually during this time? I made some videos about the early papacy. We will hopefully, in fact, get into that aspect too. But that's also something that is often studied since the Sutre donation, the 8th century, if anything, so the reawakening of the Franks, etc. But the 7th is an underrated century for many reasons. I realized that also, like in the cycle, we talk less about that, but because there is objectively less to know. There would be more to know, much more to know, in fact, if it wasn't so less documented than the other periods. But that's why it's so seminal and conceptually binding, right, as a bridge between this apparently two different eras. Needless to say, it doesn't make any sense to let's say, to reason in the terms I illustrated if one thinks that basically Italy did not count in the broader view of the same Byzantines that at some point were fundamentally obliged to bail out of it. Of course, there were more directly threatening and sort of vital issues for Constantinople than Italy as essentially a far west, or at least a western, in fact, too distant province of some sort. But had it been just about Rome, and this is, I would say, what Justinian's reconquest really was really worth, the whole connection with the Arabs was justified, and evenly so for an emperor that was Roman in name. Now, today we will talk, if anything, about certain aspects of Byzantine Italian power that show the gradual fragmentation, in fact, of this, namely imperial force, against what could but not be an imperial one in its own way. The Saint Gregory the Great, that I hope any of you knows, like the reason of his importance, and not just, again, because of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. That was definitely a big part of it, but in general, like in terms of probably the shift from that sort of more universal horizon to a one that had acknowledged the shortcomings of the same Byzantines and the necessity of the papacy to restart in their own way from properly a Latin Germanic basis, was in fact himself describing the Byzantine Empire as an ineffective entity in safeguarding Rome. All right, Rome is not just a random thing, right? The Byzantine Empire, yes, I call it always like that for reasons that I explained countless times. But remember that the entire point of we can argue, at least the Euro-Mediterranean world, was the metaphysical ethnicity achieved by the Romans as the absolute and eternal empire. Right, this was further clothed in Christian meaning, the church emerging exactly as the autonomous first estate as the priesthood, at least if you want to, depending on how you see the first or the second estate, as a matter of fact, whether the warriors or the priests, that, of course, was to safeguard itself for the ultimate purpose of safeguarding the second estate as well. So when a pope, as it also happened throughout the early Middle Ages, has some pretty strong problems against Constantinople, it's not because of some strange deviation of the former, but actually and notoriously of the latter, in ways that, in fact, simply transcend the same Byzantine boundaries, given that especially the Latin Germanic world in this period was, as always, by the way, in a parity, in fact, depending on, I'm not digress on broader theological issues, but notoriously way more orthodox than the Byzantine one, right? In early medieval times, even the same Arian heretics were actually supporting the papacy in his orthodox stances against the complete deviation and opportunism of openly heretical at times Byzantine imperial policies aimed just at trying to save some heretic provinces that were lost anyway. There are people who still have problems in understanding what Orthodox or Catholic means. They think that it's just like, I don't know, those kind of, Easterners and this Russian stuff and, the Roman popes. They literally do not understand what Orthodox and Catholic mean in basic, elementary, ancient Christian history. And I stress this, literally, like most so-called adult people believe that Orthodox means that and Catholic means that. They absolutely have no idea of what they both mean at the same time in the universal meaning of the empire, zero. And that, by the way, for example, the Greek Orthodox Church today, official's name is, of course, Catholic, right, as that was the first name of the church since ever, and that, of course, the Roman Catholic Church is by far, actually, the most traditionally permeated one, also thanks to what I call like the Germanic Catholic miracle during the migration here, and that has a lot to do with this dynamics as well. So if Gregory the Great says that the Byzantine Empire sucks in defending the holy city of Rome, the center of the entire world, as it was understood by basically everybody involved that did not believe that Constantinople was the center of the world, and by everybody involved, I literally mean up until northeastern Europe. Like, everybody knew that, right? It was not like a mystery. It's not like people lived in a weird fog of war. Everybody knew, since up to also northwestern, think about the Gaelic church, the Celtic church, like what Rome was and why, right? Most people just think that, again, like in this paradox games, basically the entire YouTube culture bought into this meme that, what if the empire had reconquered this or that? They don't understand that the empire is a metaphysical and Catholic entity, and that spreads always from Rome. It has nothing to do with who controls that, but that is able to, in fact, do so in the first place. Romanity does not belong to merely like a statal continuity. It belongs to the actual metaphysic ethnicity of the empire, just like it was extremely clear to the Ottonians, especially from Otto II onwards, but that was already deeply understood since Carolingian times, actually uninterruptedly since antiquity. In any case, the Byzantines were really going through pretty heavy stuff that also makes you naturally understand why they were behaving so haphazardly, to say the least. And in this sense, that I make lots of Byzantine history content that looks at that side of the aisle in perspective, and that is a proper Byzantine history from the within of that civilization. So obviously the Byzantine behavior towards Italy was a failure on the longer run, for the simple fact that they didn't have enough force, in fact, like the empire had back in the day, for, again, reasons that are evidently to be read across the centuries rather than in some specific generations. But these ones, and I made lots of videos about this period, literally so, we are in the early 7th century and beyond, because it was also not simply stopping there. Definitely the most disgregational phase of the empire. The Islamic invasions in particular would halven the imperial extension, where other peoples that were basically acting jointly against that, in fact, universal power that absolutely the Byzantine Empire maintained, like the sort of the greatest legacy of, in strictly political terms, at the time. We know how in the Danubian and Balkan areas the empire faced pressures from Slavs, Avars, and Bulgars, while in the east it dealt with the revitalized aggression of the Persian Empire that would be actually short-lived, and at least the Byzantines would win, so that also Persia should be understood and seen a bit more in its specific inability in historical times, essentially, since the Achaemenid wants to project its power further west, as a matter of fact, regardless of the fact that, of course, the Sasanians were pretty dangerous and really coming pretty close to the destruction of Constantinople, or at least its capture. Between 612 and 614, in fact, the Sasanian dynasty's forces overpowered the Byzantines, seizing the same Damascus, Jerusalem, and Egypt. Right. So when you think about the Islamic invasion, just realize that these provinces that were the most problematic, the ones that, again, had been openly spreading heresies, regardless of the historical Hellenistic and Roman proximity to in fact, eventually at this point Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, were opening the doors to the Persians, right? In part, it is because the Byzantine army is beaten across the land, and these communities couldn't quite simply defend themselves by themselves. But also, you cannot simply achieve this enormous result of taking over basically like the entire Levantine region of the empire, and some of its most important and largest centers, by the way, also in terms of, as we've seen here, of spiritual influence, because let's remember that the Sasanians were not Christian, by the way, and so if they manage to take over these places, there is also something there, not just the heresy, but what kind of vision these Christians had in terms of the acceptance of external rulers. That it's difficult not to see a crisis, not to see a divide, right? Byzantine culture, like the Greekness of it, as it would basically shrink to in the following generations, let's be honest about it, was in fact historically different from the Semitic, the Chamitic sort of background of these countries. It doesn't matter how soaked themselves in sort of, in fact, Hellenistic, we said before, Roman history, had historically been and would remain, in fact, other countries. We get too much the impression, as we were making the point regarding, for example, the Romano-Italic and the Greco-Byzantine world, this time, that the empire was just an homogeneous thing, that everybody had gotten Romanized, that nobody cared about ethno-linguistical differences. I made hours of question and answer videos recently just to also address part of that issue. Nothing more wrong than this multicultural cosmopolitan myth. At least, the answers I gave to those questions were, if anything, like looking at sort of even more local differences or something interesting and something less than a universal view. Universal views existed, but the core question, which is also the reason why an empire had been stretching from Scotland to the Persian Gulf without too much issues for centuries, and now was reduced to these laws, is not a matter of some, again, uniform entity that just has soldiers to throw at things to maintain control, but it's fundamentally a political, a moral a spiritual matter of agreement in true Catholic unity that we explained in its traditional and also pre-Christian meaning many times. Now, today we will not repercur, let's say, all the chapters of the Byzantine struggle against the Avars, the Slavs, the Bulgars, and the Sasanians. God forbid. Again, we made so many videos about that. It's beautiful topics. We'll absolutely come back on that because all these theaters are incredibly fascinating and incredibly nuanced in the broader picture. But it's important here at least to picture what was happening at this point, of course, in these areas, as opposed to Italy, that from a Byzantine standpoint definitely had its problems, namely the Longobards, but that was essentially a more stable and also, generally speaking, more civilized land, telling the truth. Now, the Byzantine response and counteroffensive, as you know, were prompt. Like the Byzantine civilization displayed all its might, also in its rigidity and its stubbornness, with that sort of ever more tendentially Hellenically xenophobic and say socially conservative fashion that definitely allowed for the fundamentals of the empire not to crumble, but to at least carry out some remarkable counter-strikes, right? I also recently made a video about Emperor Heraclius that, as you know, reclaimed all these eastern lost territories by 624. Regardless of the cost benefits of this for the later Islamic invasions and what happened, that's a topic for another lesson. Also, the root causes that enabled the Sasanian invasion, widespread animosity towards it's not much the Byzantines, but I would probably use the term Greeks, because let's be honest, the Byzantine Empire was de facto a Greek thing already at this point, regardless of all the shades, regardless of the official language of the empire that changed, by the way, at this point. I'm also preparing a video on the Byzantine themes. Was really gravitating around the Aegean world. Also, in fact, these animosity was driven by, for example, religious tensions among the Jewish communities and the monophysite churches in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. All these matters were remaining unresolved. At some point, between the Islamic invasions and the iconoclastic crisis, many of these communities, especially their elites that had the means to go away, would seek refuge, not much in Constantinople, but in Rome, right? There were certain quarters of Rome, like we have St. Mary in Cosmedin, for example. It was the area of the Greeks, right? They were actually minority compared to the scholar of the Germans, but they were an important part. Rome was, at least in its higher elite culture, also a multilingual city, like speaking both Latin, Romance, and Greek. At some, especially also in the administration, etc. That's something we'll see now as well. These issues remained unresolved because they were too big at large for the empire to address. Right, there was much about the aforementioned affirmation of Byzantine fundamentals, including the repression, persecution of the Jews, also of other, other communities. Also, from an educational point of view, that had come at a cost. All right, the Byzantine world was truly much more crystallized and more elitistic. The West wasn't like that, right? And actually, the Byzantine crisis in Italy is actually reflective of this dynamic, right? The Eastern communities sort of maintain even certain Hellenistic and Byzantine characters throughout the Islamic age. The West had always been the West, and it's just not a reconquest that the consequences of which last basically just a generation, at least in the integrity, or even less in the integrity of Italy, that can simply make this place a properly Byzantine world. We're maybe habituated to think this because of the splendid mosaics of Ravenna, and everybody says, and many other across Italy, to say, well, look, this is Byzantine art. This is the Byzantines, right? The Byzantine. Okay, but who were these Byzantines actually? All right, because that magnificent art is immediately distinguishable, like every historian of art knows that, in a much more deeply humanistic way as an Italian one, compared to the actually much, we can't say much poorer Byzantine art in a sense, because at least especially until the Islamic invasions, we have a lot of artifacts from that culture, etc. But that in fact would be less performing in later centuries. So as you know, I dedicated myself to debunk a bit this myth of this hard to die myth of the only alleged, because frankly as a historian I can't think of a time in which there would have been a Latin Germanic backwardness, and especially emphasizing that the barbarization of the Byzantines during this critical times, right? It's true that the Latin Germanic world was very different in its own sort of extremes. This is partly true also in the Byzantine world, but the Byzantine world is more like a polar world, like you have more much like a true center in Constantinople, right? In the West, the true center was Rome. It would kept being that also because it was actually the largest city in the West still, and actually some of the largest Byzantine cities at this point were located in Italy, right? If you look at Verona or Pavia, etc., like they're actually big, and there weren't so many other like that also in the East. Constantinople was just a few hectares larger than Rome, by the way, and it would naturally remain the largest city for a long time. But the general point is that while the Byzantine system began basically just revolve around that center, sucking everything from that periphery to the center itself, the Latin Germanic world would do nothing but sort of revitalizing itself and expanding with an enormous, by the way, injection of culture, of power, of spirit from the very Rome that evidently follows a completely different trend. And this could have not been possible if Rome had not shaken itself. You can argue at some point the very chains, like popes were even deported and killed by the Byzantines. That's their idea of dealing with priesthood, by the way, which failed anyway, because they lost Rome and they lost the papacy also pretty early, right? I made some videos about the Militia Romanorum. I already highlighted how basically like the Byzantine presence in Rome, regardless of the fact that you can argue that the papacy was, of course, like with the Duchy of Rome, a part of the empire, remained for a short time. We get, especially in this period, as we will see now, that still the mention of this essentially Byzantine troops that, however, were evidently also counting as such also on the local Roman levy, because who are the Byzantines, right? It could be Italians, it could be Greeks, it could be Syrians, etc. And regardless of especially the officials that were very high and reflecting that sort of Byzantine hierarchy and coming from different places, and also in many other ways, like there were, for example, lots of Longobards that served also in the Byzantine army against the Longobards of Italy that had important commands in the Balkans. They served in Armenia. They had so it's also from the Latin Germanic West. There's not just the Byzantine Empire actively acting in this way, so to say. Again, Rome would soon emancipate itself, right? We do not see pretty much like the Byzantine presence anymore. We realize that its forces were already at this point quite maturely local and capable of challenging the same Byzantine power. It's obvious that in all of this, the papacy, by the way, would be resentful towards an empire who was not simply able to defend it. In fact, during the pontificate of Gregory the Great, you have an initial phase where the Longobards were actually enemies of Rome. They plundered her surroundings. They deported Romans as slaves in France, like all these kind of brutal phenomena. But quite soon, the Longobards became became milder. They understood the importance of the papacy in Italy. They didn't actually persecute, even as Arians, the Catholic clergy. There weren't, at least, violent instances that we can simply document. This is true also for many other Arians that, for example, the Vandals were credited with. Surely there were some expulsions, many Catholic priests fled, etc., but it's not like we see many destructions or actual persecutions or whatever. The Longobards in particular were quite sensible and practical in that regard, and as you know, especially under their Bavarian queen Theodolinda, who was wife first to Author and then to Agilulf, the relations with the papacy really warmed up. Gregory the Great had a pretty extensive epistolary exchange with the same Theodolinda. That was the baptism of one of Agilulf's sons as Catholic, while Agilulf was an Arian himself. So actually the relations fundamentally normalized, right? The Longobards were enemies of the papacy just basically at the beginning of their history, so up to this point basically, and just in the very later phase of the later decades of their history, in between, they were actually allies to the Pope, and actually very good and strong Catholics by that point. But people do not study very much the in-between of Longobard history. Sometimes they don't even realize how important the Longobard kingdom as a polity it was. At some point was actually, especially during the fragmentation of the Frankish kingdom into 4 chunks, de facto like the largest power, Christian power in the West. So the relations, by the way, between the papacy and the Byzantines is quite interesting. It's also fairly well documented considering the times, and it's more something that we should make another video about, especially since, in fact, the Justinian Reconquest to this time, because it's sort of more more obviously highlighting the initial cooperation that was meant to perpetuate the historical connection between emperors and the papal power, also in the form of its estates, and scattered pretty much throughout all the Italian peninsula, especially in the south and in Sicily, that at some point, as you know, was lost to the Arabs. So very difficult times in which the papacy realizes the importance of opening to the Latin Germanic world, and not much just to the Byzantine one, which didn't fully serve that plenitude that the empire was supposed to be. All right. This was accompanied, as we've seen, with resentments scattered pretty much all across the empire. Right. There is a broader, again, universal narrative to this. But there were also more or less opportunistic reasons for this, and other, in fact, more or less legitimate one. It seems to us that the papal one was by far the longest cited, and the Eastern one the sort of less understandable, given the self-sabotage and the destruction and the ultimate conquest by the Arabs. But hey, the Egyptians literally opened their gates to them. As we were saying before, also about Syria, Palestine, etc., it had been obvious that Byzantine subjects had basically opened the gates to the Sasanian invaders. This is what, in fact, would identically happen when the Islamicized Arabs will march through these places. To a degree. Yes, had the empire been stronger, probably would have not lost these places, but these places were already foreign to that Byzantine world we were highlighting before, at least its Greekness and its Constantinopolitan center. During the 30s and the 40s of the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire thus notoriously has permanently lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and, by the way, portions of the Exarchate of Africa as well, mostly because of the Arabs. Concurrently, in Italy was instead the Longobards, led by their formidable King Rotary, very famous in general in Longobarд history, but also widely in Germanistics because of the production of the single most important source in Germanic law, that is, in fact, Rotary's edict, ruling between 636-652, who had resumed his campaigns as properly the rightful ruler of the Longobards that had, since Authority basically accepted the existence of a unique kingdom. It's really a myth, in fact, mostly pertaining equally to the very beginning and the very end of Longobard history, that they were sort of separate, independent duchies that did whatever they wanted. This is absolutely wrong, right? The opposite is true. The Longobard kingdom was characterized by a striking public authority and political unity compared to basically any other Romano-Germanic kingdom of those times. And there are very macroscopic and specific reasons for this that we will talk, if anything, better and more when resuming a Longobard history. Rotary launched the Longobards to the conquest of an important set of lands that up to that point had served especially the Byzantine coastal control. In fact, he captured Genoa, and together with that, Liguria, raising, by the way, the former city as walls to the ground to prevent any sort of kind of entrenchment from any coup from the sea or something, and obliterating as well the Byzantine stronghold of Oderzo in the Veneto, which was relevant in as much as you know, in the Venetian lagoons, the Venetians were basically starting to oppose themselves as in fact more maritime reality to the more continental Longobard interland, right? It was a very brutal war made of, as it had usually been up to that point, between the Byzantines and the Longobards. And I say the Byzantines, but as we said before, also parts of the same Longobards against the Longobards, in as much as, in fact, part of these were still considering themselves Byzantine federati / Symmachoi, made, in fact, a typical tit-for-tat, right, raids, destruction of towns, etc., mostly for eminently strategic purposes, not much of blind rage or barbarity. Again, like the Longobards are mostly out of control just in the first phase of their so-called ducal anarchy, when they stopped electing kings between 574 584. At this point, they actually are a might to reckon with, of properly like kingly and regional proportions that, in fact, shows that the Byzantines have lost the initiative in Italy, so much so that at some point in the 40s, the empire will recognize the Longobards, the territories that they had conquered from them, which is a big deal, right? Thinking of how important the deal of Reconquest had been. Again, made lots of videos about this early phase of Longobard history. If anything, we will come back on it again, but you already have enough content to look at. Now, this series of wars significantly elevated the role of armies throughout the empire's provinces because of the obvious provincialization in defense that will again take on the more like a so-called thematic profile, which was actually a fairly long-term process rather than an actual reform, but that surely corresponded to this fragmentation of imperial authority. Just as increasing religious intolerance and imperial interference in doctrinal issues fostered discontent and desires for autonomy in various regions, including Italy. And with the support of the broader West, again, this is incredibly important to stress, the same Arians, together with Catholics in the Latin Germanic world, backed the papacy against the Byzantine equilibristic shenanigans in favor of well-recognized heresies in the East. All this was concretely, politically and territorially, mirrored by the growing influence of armed forces and their commanders, creating opportunities for local rebellions, as well as the persistent ambitions of exarchs and dukes. These leaders often sought unchecked personal authority, occasionally even aiming for the imperial throne. There were all kinds, the sort of more properly Greco-Byzantine ones, and some of the more core lands of the empire, and sort of more federati / Symmachoi, sort of barbaric background leaders, also ambiguous loyalty to the empire as well. The extent of which, in fact, was floating exactly on the basis of these constant revolts and general opportunistic moves. Such trends of regionalism, autonomism, and chronic military uprisings, led by figures termed antartai or tyrants by contemporaries quite meaningfully, extensively impacted the exarchate of Ravenna, Rome, Campania, and Sicily in particular. We're talking about Italy today. These are areas that evidently have a quite interesting degree of provincial capacity. The sort of the Longobards duchies are understood, again, to have had the level of aforementioned autonomy for a while in different ways, and we often take too much like the Byzantine Italy as the sort of most fixed and, generally speaking, decadent one, gradually eroded by the Longobards later on. But there were large swathes of land that maintain, in fact, some important political autonomy also within the same Byzantine Italy, and not in correspondence of also more famous specific political districtuation, like, for example, the same exarchate of Ravenna that had at least to control the whole peninsula, or say, I don't know, the Venetian lagoons, or Sicily just per se. For example, also Campania was particularly important. Rome, there was the Duchy of Perugia. At least it was a very strategically relevant territory along the Flaminia road that connected, in fact, Rome with Ravenna across the Apennines, across all sort of an incasa, a fortified path contended with the Longobards. And let's consider that regardless of the sort of more catastrophistic, at the end of the day, estimates about properly the number of population existing in Europe and the Mediterranean after Justinian's pandemic, these invasions, etc., was counting in the major chunks of Europe in the multiple millions, even some millions, as a matter of fact. And Italy in particular was continuously going to be the most densely populated and also per capita rich region in all this, which also tells you in part why they managed to autonomize further from Constantinople, and why especially the Longobard political and social formula seemed more enticing. It would ultimately win over almost the entirety of the peninsula, at least before the Franks took it over themselves. And as an Italian phenomenon, and as within Italian phenomenon, much an external foreign thing, but something that was built by the Longobards together with the Romans, and especially the civil, juridical, administrative help of the latter. And that we know as, in fact, the extremely advanced and civilized Longobard kingdom that, the meme is the Longobards, the most terrible barbarians of all, like notoriously. Longobard Italy had a level of public control, literate dukes, like probably a level of centralization, by the way, for which, like in these civil terms, was light years ahead to, for example, the Franks. And so let's not confuse simply like the civil and the military aspect. Those are very, very different things. And also regarding the latter, the Longobards were in the norm. It was just basically the Franks that were really starting to become, especially under the Carolingians, better than everybody else in the West. So before recapturing Jerusalem, which was a massive feat in religious symbolism, and more, Heraclius was compelled to dispatch the patrician and cubicularius Eleutherius to Ravenna, which in the impendence of such military operations tells you also how relevant it was, with the objective specifically to quell a revolt that had resulted in the murder of the exarch John and other high-ranking civil officials. Eleutherius thus advanced to Rome and Naples with Ravenna's troops, suppressing the rebellion led by the tyrant John, so-called tyrant John. We know, unfortunately, a few about these events, like all the political intrigue behind that and even the military operations. We are lucky enough to understand what kind of timing and geographical context we were discussing. It's evident that within the same Byzantine world was some kind of rebellion, not much against properly imperial authority, but just for essentially rising to power. This is very Byzantine. Anyway, constant revolts, coups. The same Heraclius, as you know, had begun with an uprising in Africa, from which had managed to take over Constantinople later on. So the Byzantines and the Romans in general had been quite known for their lust for power through this civil wars de facto, in terms of, especially in this late antique, still, because this is still late antique, the last phase of late antique political system. Even in fact at the detriment of the broader struggle against the Longobards, that in some ways were more disadvantaged, but still also capitalized on this Byzantine infight, all right, which seems to have been genuinely fueled from the within, right? Not much due to, of course, like Longobard interference would have been there, but this probably was a problem within the same Byzantine world, where really just like one person could have so much power, such as the political and military one entailed by the exarchate over such a rich region. However, buoyed by his success in these imperial missions, Eleutherius himself, in fact, turned rebel, only to be in turn slain by Ravenna's soldiers, followed by the customary practice of decapitation and the dispatch of his head to Constantinople. This is also quite interesting because these Ravenna troops were essentially run by cadres of Byzantine officers of different origins, but were also men as file and rank soldiers by the local Italian troops. This tells you how, in fact, balancing even the higher authority could be, depending on his excesses. More than else, it seems like the Greco-Byzantines were quite rapacious. You know, that say their taxation was particularly heavy. There was this tension, in fact, like more of a colonial mindset from the Greco-Byzantine element to squeeze wealth out of this peripheral, geographically speaking, provinces. That, in the case of Italy, however, found like a strong resistance, as we will see now, in all these various centers, because there were enough resources for self-defense and sort of managing this political turmoil in a more autonomous fashion. In the 40s of the 7th century, another uprising erupted in Rome herself, spearheaded by the Cartularius Maurice in the city and its fortresses. You know, all these Byzantine titles. Cartularius was basically an administrator, quite connected also with the bureaucracy, but also with access to wealth, taxation, etc. This is particularly relevant because the purpose was evidently autonomizing Rome from Ravenna. And so, of course, this local Byzantine official was supported by the Romans, who wanted essentially to establish a more autonomous power on their own. Yet when the Ravenna army arrived across the Apennines to restore imperial authority, Maurice was deserted by both the civilian and military leaders, as well as the entire Roman army. So the army of the city of Rome had suffered the same fate as Eleutheris's, though it was exhibited in Ravenna's circus by the exarch. Right, the exarch's head was more suited to Constantinople, and any other sort of Italian subject's head was more suited to the circus of Ravenna, as a matter of fact. I don't have to present like the importance of the exarchate of Ravenna. We talked about it in other episodes. The Roman people was, as you understand here, a force over which these powers were floating. The same Ravenate one was like this. Here we see also a competition historically between the metropolitic sees and the increasing papal ambition as an autonomous center capable of hegemonizing, in fact, not just the peninsula, but spiritually the entire Latin Germanic West and beyond. So when you look at this tit for tat, such incidents continued throughout the century. Right, from Rome to Ravenna, yes, you had to cross the Apennines, but there were these mighty Roman roads, regardless of the decline. There was a general proximity, a sense that, again, this space was manageable, but through more like an internal system than, in fact, a dependency on Constantinople proper. This, by the way, did maintain some specifically Byzantine characteristics, including, for example, the gruesome pattern of beheadings, mutilations of eyes, noses, and tongues, and macabre public displays. We also observed that, as for that matter, about some Roman warlords against the Ottonians in the 10th century Urbs, but that's sort of another story. I mean, it's not like the Frankish tradition. It was, as you know, more tender with those fallen out of grace. Nevertheless, this history is described with unflinching bluntness by contemporary sources, notably the Liber Pontificalis of the Roman Church, which is one of the most beautiful medieval history sources for that matter, and a veritable gold mine of information that haven't probably even just been fully simply reconstructed. I mean, again, it's a very famous, very notorious source, but the more you dig into that, the more you find, in a sense. Just for saying, like, remember that narrative sources are the cornerstone of any historical objectivity, contrary to what you have been said, namely that this would be so subjective. Pick up these books because they are all publicly, available online with top editions. The Liber Pontificalis, by the way, is a papal source proper or mostly ecclesiastical history, but it also tells the history of Rome. And my impression is that probably there is a lot to dig into the existence of a Roman military at this point. Like, who did among all these very powerful officials, later lords, etc., and especially within a Roman context, where, of course, the Byzantines were away, nobody came back there, so manned by Romans, like, who did actually wield power in that sense? Like, Rome was pretty big. Like, these operations involved pretty big quantities, as a matter of fact. So we're talking the early Middle Ages, and we know how undocumented they are, especially for certain parts of of the world, but Rome, even the Rome of, let's say, the center of the world at the time, offers just so much that we can use to properly know how, for example, how did the militia and properly like the Roman army, because militia is intended the Latin way here, so including the militaries, really actually worked. This is not so clear, right? But if you look at certain political and social indicators, you realize that it was actually a pretty advanced thing, and it's an important theme because of the recurrent issue of like managing essentially a papal and an imperial authority in a city that, however, had its own push for autonomy. And this is something it's like the leitmotif of Roman history for most of the Middle Ages, as a matter of fact. And that is often underrated because Rome had a very powerful lay nobility, and so it's not just who did rule in Rome or what, like the emperor came to be crowned. We all know that political history, it all depended on whether you could control Rome, that is the Romans, or not. And these Romans turned out to have been pretty well military organized to some extent. Throughout the 7th century, an exercitus or militia held sway in major cities and fortresses. In fortresses, this force could function as a mobile unit, while in cities where core political interactions occurred, it was embodied by an elite group of optimates, which included a small cadre of senior officials, the judices, so the judges, not always of military character. And the latter group also played a role in episcopal appointments and shaped the decisions of bishops. So there was obviously a convergence of lay and temporal powers that would remain throughout the centuries. Regardless, in fact, of the Byzantine presence, a hallmark also the development of capitular chapters, administratively speaking, like with an enormous juridical boosting. Again, what we see also in the Longobards world was pretty much akin to also the Byzantine one in Italy, because that's the ultimate consequence that the Italian peninsula was regionalizing in a more or less homogeneous fashion, like with the decentralization from Constantinople. Not just the Longobard and Byzantine sides looked much more alike, but basically Longobards were taking over practically the entire system. Because it was that homogeneous, and this didn't even happen through dramatic wars after this very period, like the first decades of the 7th century. So we understand that a military existed and it also was maintained. Rome, for example, was besieged also in later times, like in the late 8th century when the Franks arrived to succor her by, for example, the entire Italian Longobard army, with literally contingents arriving from the north, from the south, look around the city, from all over the country. And so you understand that the system could have not held hadn't there been a Roman army that, however, we were not fairly well informed about. The economic and fiscal underpinnings of the military classes at this point was naturally different from the one of the previous era. Let's say the broader late antique sort of tax collection system, the idea of public authority was basically melting away, was being eroded. This does not mean, however, that resources weren't there. They were becoming sort of more locally exploited and, let's say, also at a shorter range than it had historically been the case. Like here, the world war is sort of shrinking in many demographic and economic fashion. But again, in relative terms, we're still looking at pretty significant forces. There were, by the way, some political motivations connected still with the fundamental need to obtain the military wages known as roga. In other words, there was actually some vestige of public administration bureaucracy that still worked as far as the funding of a public force was understood. Of course, this was taking on ever more the characters of some local, provincial capacity. They made a video about medieval Lazio in which we essentially focus on that dialectic between Rome and the surrounding towns, where, in fact, the urbs tended to always have some sort of overall control over the surroundings in virtue of what? Of a Roman army that was capable of carrying out expeditions in the surrounding province and taming this and that town. As early as 592, Gregory the Great had observed, however, the army's reluctance to serve due to unpaid salaries. In 592, Gregory the Great had observed the army's reluctance to serve due to unpaid salaries, which mostly referred to the still an age in which the Militia Romanorum corresponded to some sort of provincial Byzantine force. It was troops that were a mix essentially between Byzantine soldiers from properly also the east and local Romans, in a blend that had still a regional capacity of intervention. The fact that these guys would not want to serve because they hadn't received salaries still tells us that by this point they did receive them. And as we've seen, this is still a period in which, the properly exarchs are sent from Constantinople and they operate across Italy. In fact, a few years later, after quashing the revolt of John of Conza, that was a Campanian official, Campanian magnate, Campania was part of the Byzantine Empire at this point, and returning to Ravenna, the patrician Eleutherius distributed the roga, so the pay, to the soldiers, restoring calm. So still as late as the end of the 16th century, the imperial treasury and also the local one contributed to the pay of what was understood as a professional army across Italy, by the way. And the system that we described before is mostly provincial in nature, is, say, following the end of this late antique system, mostly in the 7th century, again, is the moment of greatest contraction, when, as we've seen, the empires struggled to maintain the army through a consistent salary system, supported by a structured fiscal framework, soon resurfaced because of more or less the political loosening of the entire system. As churches, especially the Roman one, increasingly resisted taxation, by the way, fiercely condemning imperial force to raise levies on their lands, the military became acutely aware how papal control over lands and revenues worsened the challenge of compensating at least imperial soldiers. This is also extremely important because, as we understand here, the Byzantines were still capable of simply imposing themselves in the peninsula. And the papacy had already at this point an immense power. Basically, all what had historically been the public domain, yes, in theory, would have been seen by the Byzantines as their own, or at least the empires, and so publicly disposable by civil authority. But de facto was now starting to belong to the Roman Church. This is very famous, in early, in medieval Roman history and beyond, because the Church of Rome would, of course, increase in power, but had very specific, as sophisticated administrative ways to profit from land leasing through the emphitheuses, etc. And behind this issue of having, especially the very rich church's land untaxed, the papacy wasn't responding just to an imperial interference in its possessions, because as we've seen, the Byzantines had a quite predatorily rapacious mentality, especially as far as whatever they could tax. There were really massive amounts of gold the cities had to pay as a tithe to Constantinople at some point, and this is actually a very sort of graphic idea of how much wealth was entailed. the papacy was opposing itself to the imperial army in this sense to sabotage its very presence and allowing for essentially a Roman, we can say simply a papal one, because it's not like the papacy in all its might simply controlled lay Rome. Again, the laity was also deeply connected with the papacy because these popes, think about Gregory the Great from the gens Anicia, came from some of the most noble, some of the most elite, some of the most highly educated senatorial episcopal families in the world actually at the time, because the Romano-Italic aristocracy was by far way more noble and traditional, etc., than essentially the bureaucratized and gentrified Byzantine Senate in the way it had been socially constituted since Constantine's times, to in fact avoid the senatorial interference. And instead in Rome was pretty strong. So essentially, as we will see now, it's the Romans that are resisting to such infringement from the side of the Byzantine authorities. By the way, I made a video now that I remember about about Rome between the Ostrogothic sieges during the Gothic War, highlighting the Latin Germanic ties against Byzantine rule and how already at that point actually the Romans were in pretty intense connection with the Goths in order to sort of sabotage the Byzantine reconquest. Think about this, because I honestly never found on YouTube any channel that sort of went beyond, again, that kind of incredibly superficial notion of simply like it was the Byzantines as a polity versus, I don't know, the Goths as another polity, without understanding what politics means, how societies work, and what kind of power mechanisms actually occurred behind that, especially in such developed areas. In 640, shortly after Pope Severinus' election, following a prolonged papal vacancy, in fact, his predecessor Honorius had died in 1638, and this was one of the longest sort of in-between pontificates period, just given that I'm recording, as you know, here in exactly days before the conclave. Rome's exercitus rebelled at the urging of the Cartularius Maurice, who rallied soldiers with these words. This is also relevant. Quote, what purpose does it serve that Pope Honorius has hoarded so much wealth in the Lateran episcopal palace, when none of it benefits the soldiers? Whenever the emperor sent your wages, he seized and concealed them. Right? So, in this picture, incited by these words, all armed Romans, young and old, besieged Severinus, who was barricaded in the Lateran for 3 days. Right? This is an instance where actually the same Romans are capable of exploiting the situation themselves to back actually the soldiers that are increasingly at this point detached from a Byzantine component, or more like the local soldiers. So it's more like a struggle between temporal and spiritual power. But the crisis was resolved only through the intervention of the Exarch of Ravenna in that instance, and the seizure and distribution of ecclesiastical treasures among the Exarch, Maurice, and the emperor offering at least a temporary solution. So the Pope would have not barricaded simply himself in the Lateran without support, so a part of the Romans was resisting this preying of the papal treasury. Right? But this could be used, in fact, by officials that found themselves there and could receive support, of course, by the local troops that were not merely, again, an external force. This example actually is one of the lowest in terms of sort of the Byzantine presence in Rome and the general relations with the papacy. Episodes like this would become basically ever rarer in the moment in which Byzantine power would start to fade away further, considering, by the way, that these are exactly the years of the Byzantine acknowledgement of the Lombard acquisitions and basically the exhaustion of the Byzantine mobile army in the peninsula, so of any capacity to basically strike back at the Lombards. In fact, the systemic crisis of the various exercitus arose from the breakdown of the same coherent imperial payment system. What you've seen here with the sacking of the papal treasury is just like a form of desperation, and as I was describing it, it already underscores like actually a localization of power, regardless of the fact that this wealth was shared between also like the exarch, the emperor, even so. There's still some kind of international leverage on Rome and the papacy, but it's also achieved through local support, as we've seen here. Without the Romans, there isn't actually much to do, right? The Byzantine system, however, is falling apart, compounded by the fragility of their land-based resources and their significant reliance on ecclesiastical estates through emphithouses or other tenancy arrangements. There's also militarization of local landowners to an extent that, however, stems from mostly a need of local defense than one of abroad service, for which, in fact, that public salary in one or another was needed. Right. If you rely on local resources, it's mostly, unless you are really a regional power of some sort with the capacity of moving tens of thousands of men across an entire country, it has to mostly be like provincial in measure. As Rome, you can try to control the surroundings, but at the same time, it's mostly an end to your own local reality. The empire, exactly in these years, is facing instead Islamic onslaught, and so it's concentrating his army elsewhere. In stark contrast to the army's economic and fiscal weaknesses, churches enjoyed a robust territorial base, vast economic power, and the ability to secure tax exemptions, which is exactly what the reason why, as we've seen, that the Lateran palace was sacked, or at least was, eventually the situation was diffused with the papacy essentially giving up, and that treasury, their treasury being divided by Byzantine authorities and probably also the Roman people that had backed them. But this is exactly because the church had the most robust capacity to produce further wealth locally. And so, as a consequence, also shifting allegiance and fundamentally the dependency of the local Roman army, regardless of the fact that we stop seeing it in the way at least the Byzantines had conceived it in a public fashion for the Duchy of Rome, and in fact becomes ever more sort of Roman, urbanly speaking, in nature. Just the other day we were discussing the grandeur of the basilical structures that were already visited by so many people from all over Europe and beyond. The inventories of precious items donated to the Roman Church that conclude each papal biography, by the way, in the Liber Pontificalis quite meaningfully. And from the early 8th century, even the well-documented growth of episcopal and monastic landholdings, underscoring the overwhelming economic dominance of major churches. There is a reason, if I said before, why we should talk more about the Benedictine order and the very powerful monasteries that were established at this point and that felt as incredibly connected to Rome as a city, not just to the papacy per se. We're talking, of course, Monte Cassino, Farfa, right? So, again, major foundations that contributed to the power of the papacy, but in the sense also the lay families of Rome that participated to that game. And here the Byzantines are basically not out of the equation because the Exarchate of Ravenna is there, but still essentially within like an Italian space, right? The last big Byzantine presence, as we'll see now, was, say, from an external standpoint, was under Constans II, whose Italian journey did not end exactly well for many reasons. Against the backdrop of Church's rising economic might, the military class struggled to achieve social unity or sustain effective conduct, at least as far as, again, the Byzantines had hoped to control on a large scale. Repeated political crises in 7th century Byzantine Italy typically began with the deployment of the exercitus by emperors, exarchs, or so-called tyrants, followed by resolutions negotiated at the highest political and ecclesiastical echelons. In other words, you see ever more outlined the ecclesiastical power evidently having the cards, to say the least, to counterpose itself to the Byzantine imperial force. This, again, as you understand, must have entailed some local forces siding with the church, right, in a never more independent sort of local fashion. Sometimes, like we even the Longobards helped the papacy against the Byzantines. This is sort of forgotten. Famously, the Battle of the Salarian Bridge is an exception, but let's say everything is also getting more local among the Byzantines themselves, and this does take on now like a provincial character rather than the broader, say, ecumenic Mediterranean one. These are, again, we're in the mid-7th century. So these patterns are evident in a series of notable Byzantine efforts in Italy, as we hinted at before, under Constans II, who ruled between 641 and 668. I made a video about Constans' reign, so if you're interested sort of in just the Byzantine imperial perspective of the story, you can look at that. Constans came in Italy chiefly to curb Arab expansion in the Mediterranean. However, he attempted to reclaim parts of Longobard-controlled southern Italy, particularly the Duchy of Benevent, the capital of which was besieged, although fruitlessly, as the Longobards successfully resisted the Byzantine army. To address the religious schisms among Christian churches which had open avenues for adversaries, Constans II attempted to enforce a decree prohibiting further debate on monophysitism, which means that you basically couldn't criticize the imperial machinations to re-enable say, relations with these heretics that in the meanwhile had passed under Islamic control and were in the process of, and that the Byzantines at that point still thought they could simply handle, while the same emperor was running basically to Sicily in order to control basically now a westward, let's say, and also from the Western Mediterranean Arab push, right? Because gradually they were expanding along the North African shore. However, in fact, this imperial overreach again sparked resistance in the West, because in Italy they did not really want to have to do with an emperor coming there. It's like being closer, ruling from Sicily. What is that, right? Remember that Sicily at this point is still not just Byzantine. I made a video about Byzantine Sicily in particular, but still hosts, as we were remembering before, lots of papal latifundia, right? So an important amount of wealth that evidently the emperor wants to lord over, to sort of draw resources from. And in fact, the main issue with the locals occurred between Constans and Pope Martin in 649. After managing to resolve this dispute, Constans II personally led that military campaign in Italy, first targeting the Longobards of Benevent, which again was a fiasco basically, and then moving to Sicily to properly organize their broader coordination of mostly naval forces to counter the advance of Islamicized Arabs in the Mediterranean. Yet, Byzantine military endeavors were hampered by ecclesiastical opposition to heightened taxation, which was entailed, of course, by such measure, because also the capacity to simply rule because of central resources coming to Constantinople was impractical. Right at this point, the empire had dramatically shrunk by a lot, and obviously it was just easier for the emperors wherever they would mostly stay in Constantinople, but Constance really had his plan to set in Sicily, also showing how especially Sicily again is a bit different from the Italian mainland regarding the broader game that here is entailed in the Mediterranean, especially in this against the Arabs that were not really, in fact, being felt also in the continent thanks to the Byzantine navy, right? But it's mostly a coastal dimension. You know, the Longobards, for example, they have the upper hand in continental Italy, but they don't have much of a navy in practice. Because they do not really even put it together. In any case, the emperor would obviously mostly try to rely on local estates, which, in the measure in which they were part of the church, could, in the wake of this broader issue with a pope, to be used for imperial purposes, and especially the ones of the military and general defense, right? And so the papacy didn't actually want this. As you will learn better also in other videos, it was fostering a much more genuinely at this point sort of regional policy on its own, one that surely had it connected to the empire, but as we have seen at the local level, acting ever more independently, especially having an enormous reach and a much more successful cooperation with the Latin Germanic world as a whole than the Byzantine Empire. The Liber Pontificalis, again, cornerstone of these events' history, source of the Roman Church, let's stress it again, recounts how the emperor, based in Syracuse, to oversee operations against the Muslims, confiscated valuable church objects and imposed unprecedented burdens on Sicily's landowners. It also curtly records Constance II's assassination, famously enough, apparently in the bath of Syracuse, in the terms of Syracuse. The palace were relieved. We're in July 668. The dramatic end of quite an ambitious and proactive emperor that, however, didn't take the right steps. By the way, there is a pattern in this, right? The iconoclasm is just a few generations away, and basically the Byzantine officials in southern Italy would behave mostly in the same ways, mostly trying to impose this enormous exactions, trying to seize monastic possessions, etc. So this would, as you know, cause also a migration, as we were saying, of Byzantine subjects to Italy, to Rome, right? Especially from the elites, because they did not want even just to be ruled by emperors that had followed, by the way, that yet again heretical turn. Iconoclasm is a very complex thing, also a pretty obscure one, because we don't even understand fully what practically the iconoclasm really was. It's mostly just narrated by the sources of those who cancelled it, and probably using some talking points of the same iconoclast, but it's a complex topic, and I, if anything, made videos just about that to explain it a bit more pertinently. Over time, a temporary stabilization, of course, had emerged in the Byzantine-Longobard relations, with peace prevailing during the reign of the Longobard king Perctaric between 671 and 688. From already a few decades, basically, the Byzantines had recognized that Longobards had conquered vast lands in Italy, they didn't have the strength to simply recover them. And so they had concentrated on defense, but also the Longobards had halted most of the advances, maybe grabbing something here and there when it on the occasion, but not really needing to go to war against the empire, just mostly consolidating from the within. After all, they had a pretty sizable amount of territories, especially the hinterland and all over the peninsula, by the way. And time was on their side. Culturally, socially, politically, the Italian population at large was following that broader Longobardization and still from within, in fact, a pretty civilized pattern that the Byzantines couldn't even quite exhibit anymore, because their territorial domination was discontinuous. As we've seen, Ravenna couldn't quite simply control the rest of Italy, especially Rome. Most of the Byzantine presence was confined to the coastlines, not even all of them. So this was really a different world from the broader continental Italian one. These are also the reigns from the Byzantine side of the emperors Constantine IV and Justinian II. I talked about them too. There is probably a playlist called Byzantine Emperors, so if you're interested in the single rulers, you can search about them through that. And confronting, like also with other playlists, but in fact was happening in different parts of Europe at this point. Relations with the Roman Church also improved, as just with the Longobards, as basically like the Byzantines had given up trying to recover what was now part of this Italian reality, ever more intertwined within itself and ever more distant from Constantinople, culturally, politically. For example, the Byzantines reduced the tax burden on ecclesiastical estates in southern Italy, where they had the greater grip, even though basically the coastal presence was mostly the same way, and stopped funding the army through the allocation of church lands, simply for the fact that the Byzantines did not have from Constantinople the specific way to impose that, right? To basically adverse local powers that in relative terms, given the shrinking of empire, had grown more important, so they couldn't simply be exploited like before, right? So a history of gradual destructuring, as it happens in most sort of circumstances during moments of power vacuum, and that also shows fundamentally the gradual departure of the Byzantine world from Italy, from a time in which Rome had been reconquered and the country seemed basically to be reabsorbed within the imperial direct control, but that, as a matter of fact, really ended up mostly just gradually moving away, and because of forces that were agitating from the within of the same Byzantine world. Here we don't see, this system. The system, of course, was suffering of not just the Longobards that were next door and pressing, etc., but you can say all the broader issues that were occurring to the empire all across the Mediterranean, right? However, when you focus on the more sort of local realities, also because let's be honest about this, the Longobards, yes, were at this point they won essentially their place in Italy as the major power, but they were, as we've seen, far from simply like dislodging the entire Byzantine presence from Italy, and especially cornerstones like Ravenna and Rome itself. So there had been a settlement, right? It mostly is the one that we have in mind by the mid-7th century that is taken as that moment of basically of greater shrinking, like of the entire sort of Eurasian civilization at this point, and that in fact happen in this way because of the sheer lack of resources. As we were saying before, you have this expeditions like the ones of Constance. There was like also a pretty eccentric one in the pattern, like there hadn't been similar things there. Phocas had not been a very good presence either. He despoiled Rome to an extent, and that so revealed that typically Byzantine predatory mindset. And it's not just like two worlds were separating, but mostly like from the Aegean and its other sort of coastal dependencies, also in southern Italy, etc. The empire did not really have the critical mass to, again, wage major campaigns of reconquest in the West, right? They weren't even so underperforming in general sense, like in the East. However, in the East, they faced much greater challenges. All the empire's resources were quite delicately calibrated in this effort to survival, basically. So there was just so much that you could do, and this is really typical of the era. In fact, the Byzantines wouldn't re-expand either until pretty later in time, like the 9th to 10th century, when the Saracens, for example, had taken over certain parts of the south as well, and they managed to tidily reconquer that. But we have to wait essentially Macedonian times, and for centuries there was basically just a floating, a steady survival in many ways. So again, everything should be observed from sort of the small to the bigger range, so to say. Nothing happens simply overnight, or even if it does, it's because there are some fundamentals that should be understood in some moral sense. And this more gradual fading of imperial power in Italy corresponds to, in part, of course, the desire of these communities to be sheltered, for example, from the direct Longobard annexation. That would have been a big problem in general. Not just some of the cities were very well defensible. Like again, Ravenna and Rome were pretty big, but they had no interest, in fact, in being part of that system either. They preferred to autonomize themselves, even remaining, namely, within the Byzantine world. But for Rome, for example, it was just very nominal, right? Ravenna had sort of the greater mandate over Italy, so they wanted to remain under the Byzantine system. But even there, right, there wasn't this great siding simply for Constantinople per se. The same goes for the Venetian lagoons. Southern Italy, if anything, was more connected to the Byzantine Empire, but even there were some very typically Italic characteristics that were bringing to the provincialization, the decentralization of the system, also the military organization, and again, made videos about this. So this chapter, this passage, I thought to be quite important and to essentially picture some important step in the gradual enucleation of the two spheres of influences, more Germanic, the more Byzantine one, realizing that there were powerful and active, protagonistic polities in between that cannot quite simply be, in fact, framed under this or that word. And that even when, in fact, being part of formerly like the empire or another, so they were developing, like in the case of the Church of Rome, and especially because of the fact that the church was not meant to belong to the empire. In fact, a completely different really innovative identity. And again, this seems one of the most important factors in the game. Right? We will talk more about this topic and its implications in the future. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.